Hey everyone, it's Dr. Marcan, just going over the lab PowerPoint on thoracic anatomy starting Unit 4, and this will include the respiratory system as well as the vessels of the thorax. So as covered in lecture, here is an overview of the anatomy of the respiratory system. The respiratory system can be divided into an upper respiratory system as well as the lower respiratory system. This division is actually pretty important because clinically when you're trying to describe an infection or a disorder, you can actually say, the patient has an upper respiratory system versus a upper respiratory tract infection versus a lower respiratory tract infection. So you have an idea of where the infection is located or where the disorder is located. Now, the division between the upper and lower respiratory system does vary by author. As I said in lecture, there are some books that say that the upper respiratory system does include the larynx, and there are some that don't. Just know that there are variations among authors of anatomy books. For our anatomy book, the larynx is, in fact, included in the upper respiratory system. So these are the structures of the upper respiratory system. It includes the nose, the nasal cavity, the paranasal sinuses, the pharynx, as well as part of the larynx. So this includes the glottis again being that opening made up of the rima glottides, as well as the true vocal cords or vocal folds. So the superior or upper portion of the larynx is included in the upper respiratory system. The lower respiratory system will include part of the larynx, inferior to the glottis. Also includes the trachea, the bronchial tree, as well as the lungs. We also know that the respiratory system can also be divided according to zones. So first we have the conducting zone, which of course conducts the gases important for respiration, carbon dioxide as well as oxygen. And then we have the respiratory zone. This is the zone where we have exchange of gases between the structures within the lungs as well as the capillaries that surround these structures. So the conducting zone begins with the nose and ends with the terminal bronchioles. The respiratory zone does start at the respiratory bronchioles, so basically where the terminal bronchioles end, the respiratory bronchioles begin, and the respiratory bronchioles are where the respiratory zone starts. And the respiratory zone will go from the respiratory bronchioles to the terminal clusters of alveoli called alveolar sacs. So here on this next slide, we can see the respiratory zone in this picture. Now, the respiratory zone structures are microscopic, so these structures we actually do see in our histological slides of lung tissue. So respiratory zone, again, important for the exchange of oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. So the conducting zone ending at the terminal bronchiole and the respiratory zone beginning at the respiratory bronchioles, where they will continue on to alveolar ducts. And at the end of the alveolar ducts, you'll have these clusters of alveoli called alveolar sacs. So the first structures that we're going to talk about are the lungs. The lungs are located within the thoracic cavity. Some of the borders or some of the structures we can see at the borders. We know that the diaphragm is a muscle that is located inferior to the lungs. We have the space enclosed by 12 pairs of ribs, so the space where the lungs are located are enclosed by 12 pairs of ribs. And then we also have intercostal muscles, so muscles between the ribs that help move the ribs with ventilation, with both inspiration as well as expiration. So the external intercostal muscles, of course, are located externally. Inter means between, so these are the muscles located between the ribs. So the action of the external intercostal muscles includes elevating the ribs, especially during inspiration, both forced and quiet inspiration. So this elevation of the ribs allows for an increase in the volume within the thoracic cavity to accommodate the incoming air that we are breathing in through our respiratory tract. So here we can see these arrows pointing upwards. So when the external intercostal muscles contract, again, the ribs will be elevated. Then we have our internal intercostal muscles. Internal intercostal muscles, when they contract, will depress ribs. So depression of ribs allows for forced expiration. So this is more of an active process. Whereas quiet expiration, we have a relaxation. However, with the internal intercostal muscles, their contraction helps in forced expiration or forced exhalation of air. Depression of the ribs allow for a decrease in the volume within the thoracic cavity, pushing air out of the lungs. So here we see the downward action of these arrows. These internal intercostal muscles, again, will depress ribs. So of course, external intercostal muscles help elevate the ribs, allowing for expansion or increase in the volume of the thoracic cavity, accommodating incoming air that we breathe and coming in from our respiratory tract. And then we have the internal intercostal muscles that will help depress ribs and decrease the thoracic cavity volume. So each lung is housed in a separate pleural cavity. We talked about this. There's a right pleural cavity as well as a left pleural cavity, and we have the different layers that make up the pleura. So pleural cavities are lined with pleura or serous membranes. We have the parietal pleura that lines the thoracic cavity, and then we have the visceral pleura. So viscera means organ, so the visceral pleura is the pleura that lines the lung surface. So the blue representing the parietal pleura, and then the yellow line representing the visceral pleura. So each lung has a hilum, and we talked about hilums before in different structures. Hilum, again, an entry point or a region where vessels will enter and exit the organ. So each lung has a hilum, which is seen here in these yellow circles. The hilum is an entry point for the primary bronchi that carry air. The pulmonary arteries from the heart, again, pulmonary arteries, the only arteries in the body that contain deoxygenated blood. So these pulmonary arteries are transporting deoxygenated blood from the heart going towards the lungs. And then we have pulmonary veins being the only veins in the body carrying oxygenated blood, and this blood will go towards the heart, specifically the left atrium. Also within the hilum is the entry point for autonomic nerves, so nerves of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And we also have lymphatics, our lymph vessels. So this picture shows the hilum of the lung, where we see vessels entering and exiting the lung. This is located medially. So if we look at this picture, very carefully, we can see, of course, well, here's the esophagus, which is posterior. And then we have the, let's see if we can see the bronchus going towards the superior lobe. So this is actually a very deep cut. Normally you would be able to see the primary bronchi. This is the, looks like 1, 2, 3. This would be the right lung because it has 3 lobes. So we will have first the main bronchi, and then we have the secondary or lobar bronchi. So this looks like the bronchus to the superior lobe, so this would be a secondary bronchi. It doesn't state specifically what type of bronchus, but I'm assuming this might be the main bronchus. And then we have our pulmonary arteries containing deoxygenated blood, and then our pulmonary veins containing oxygenated blood going towards the left atrium. So the right lung has 3 lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior lobe. And the left lung has 2 lobes, just a superior and inferior lobe. We can see the trachea in this picture. The trachea is a tube that's supported by a series of cartilaginous C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. At the vertebral level, about T4, T5, we see the carina. The carina is where the trachea will bifurcate, and then it will bifurcate into the right and left primary or main bronchi. So the trachea ends at the carina, which is an internal ridge, and we can actually see what it would look like under bronchoscopy. So we can see, if we have a camera going down the trachea, we can see that the trachea will then bifurcate into right and left main bronchi. So the trachea will give rise to the bronchial tree. We have right and left primary bronchi, also called main bronchi. So this is the right primary bronchus, also called the right main bronchus, and here we have the left primary bronchus or the left main bronchus. You can pick one way to name your primary bronchi or main bronchi, just make sure it's spelled correctly. So there is the right primary or right main bronchus. There is the left primary or left main bronchus. The primary bronchi will then give rise to our secondary or lobar bronchi. So these bronchi will go to the individual lobes of the lung. On the right, we will have 3 secondary or lobar bronchi, and on the left, we will have 2 secondary or lobar bronchi, because of course there are 3 lobes to the right lung and 2 lobes to the left lung. So here in yellow, you can actually see the secondary or lobar bronchi. It's not necessary for you to name the individual lobar bronchi. You just have to know that they are either that they are secondary or lobar bronchi. Secondary bronchi will then branch into tertiary or segmental bronchi. These bronchi will go to the individual segments within the lobes of the lung. So this little flow chart shows you that the trachea will then transport air to the primary bronchi. There's a right and left primary bronchus. Primary bronchi will then further branch into secondary bronchi, also called lobar bronchi, because they go to the different lobes of each lung. And then the secondary bronchi will then branch into the tertiary or segmental bronchi, going to the different segments within the lobes of the lung. So these form about approximately 20 or more branches until you hit, so in this we see the trachea, the primary, then the secondary, and then the segmental or tertiary. And then we hit the respiratory zone. So the respiratory zone contains all microscopic structures, meaning you cannot see it grossly. You have to look at these structures under a microscope under the histo slides, which we saw earlier this semester. So the terminal bronchi, again, this is where the conducting zone basically ends, and the respiratory bronchioles, this is where the respiratory zone begins. So the respiratory bronchioles will then form alveolar ducts, and from the alveolar ducts towards the end, you will see sacs of alveoli called alveolar sacs. And here is a cross-section or cutaway where we can see the alveolar duct ending in individual alveoli, and clusters of them will be alveolar sacs. So we can see individual alveoli and a bunch of alveoli forming an alveolar sac. Now, don't forget the vessels that are contained within the thorax. So we will be going over models of the thorax as well as vessels that we can see from the heart. So pulmonary trunk, we can see that the pulmonary trunk will then end in left and right pulmonary arteries. Again, these arteries being the only arteries in the body that transport deoxygenated blood. There are 4 pulmonary veins that will carry blood from the lung to the left atrium. You don't need to know whether they're superior or inferior, but it is important to know right versus left. So here we see the left pulmonary veins, and here we will see the right pulmonary veins, all transporting oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart via the left atrium. You should also know the 3 branches coming off of the aortic arch. So first we will normally see the right brachiocephalic trunk, which will eventually become the right common carotid artery, and then the right subclavian artery. So here, this first branch being the right brachiocephalic trunk. Then we will see the left common carotid artery giving blood supply to the left side of the head and neck. And then we will see the left subclavian artery. This is also included on your worksheet. So these are structures that you will need to know. And again, the brachiocephalic trunk will branch into the right common carotid artery, giving blood supply to the right side of the head and neck. And then the right subclavian artery, which will eventually become the axillary artery after passing the first rib, and then become the brachial artery after passing the inferior border of the teres major muscle. Again, giving blood supply to the upper limb, specifically here on the right. For the veins, so don't forget that we have brachiocephalic veins which drain blood coming from the head and neck as well as the upper limbs. So we have the right brachiocephalic vein as well as the left brachiocephalic vein, which will drain deoxygenated blood into the superior vena cava, and the superior vena cava being one of those main vessels that empty into the right atrium. So other veins that you are responsible for include the internal jugular veins. So there's the right internal jugular vein as well as the left internal jugular vein. We can also see the right and left subclavian veins, which will all drain into the brachiocephalic veins and then draining into the superior vena cava. The phrenic nerves are important because they do give innervation not only to the heart but the diaphragm as well. Traditionally, we haven't been able to tag these nerves in the cadavers, nor do we really see them in the models. If I can find a model though, I will make sure to make sure that you do have access to that. But for the most part, traditionally we don't tag the phrenic nerves, but know that they are important with regards to innervation of the diaphragm, which aids in respiration. So besides cadaver work, you are also responsible for identifying structures within the conducting zone on the models, as well as the pictures of the models and pictures of the structures within the thoracic cavity. I will make sure to post those pictures so that you can work on identifying those structures. Make sure you are reviewing the circulatory anatomy of the lungs, where blood goes specifically from the right side of the heart to the lungs and then back to the left side of the heart. Here's just a review of the histology of the respiratory epithelium. We know that respiratory epithelium is a mucous membrane, and the majority of the epithelium within the respiratory tract is your ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. In here we can see goblet cells, which are important for producing mucus within the respiratory tract, helps expectorate any dust or particles or pathogens that you might have accidentally inhaled that stuck in the mucus, and then we can expectorate those particles either through the nose or the mouth. So we know that within the trachea we've seen our histoslides of the trachea. Again, the epithelium is a pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Make sure you can spell that correctly, especially if you see this in a lecture exam or a quiz. So pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is the lining of most of the respiratory tract. And then specifically within the trachea, we can see the hyaline cartilage that makes up the C-shaped cartilaginous rings that give support to the trachea. And posteriorly, we can see that the trachea does not have cartilage here. And a question on your worksheet asks you, what advantage is it that the rings are incomplete posteriorly? And mostly it's due to this structure. And if you read chapter 22, you'll be able to find out why there are no cartilaginous rings posteriorly and why it's important for this structure, the esophagus. So make sure you read that in chapter 22. So with bronchi and bronchioles, again, we see that pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now the largest bronchi are like the trachea, however with each branch point there is a progressive reduction in cartilage, importance of smooth muscle that increases. So here we see smooth muscle. And then eventually smaller bronchi and bronchioles will have no cartilage. And then there will be a transition from pseudostratified columnar epithelium to simple columnar and then to simple cuboidal. Structures within the respiratory zone are microscopic again, so these are structures that you'll only be able to see in histological preparations of lung tissue. Starting with our respiratory bronchioles, we can say that we can see this in a microscope, underneath a microscope, so this would be considered the respiratory bronchiole, which will then lead to an alveolar duct, and then we can see these little sacs of alveoli, which is the terminal portion of the alveolar duct. Okay, and then here we see individual alveoli. The word alveoli is actually plural, alveolus is singular, so this would be an individual alveolus, and multiple alveoli will form alveolar sacs. And the epithelium of the individual alveolus is a simple epithelium. If you can remember the type of simple epithelium, of course it's very important because you need to know that that type of epithelium actually encourages gas exchange from the alveoli to the red blood cells within the capillaries. And that is our PowerPoint on structures of the respiratory system and thoracic anatomy.